I'd never liked relying on other people for things. That's why I started doing solo cabin trips every fall. I needed that kind of time alone, completely disconnected, completely on my own. It helped reset me after a year of office noise and traffic and faces I didn't want to look at anymore. I wasn't one of those guys with survivalist fantasies. I just liked the quiet, and I liked knowing that every piece of food I ate, every bit of heat or water I got, I'd made happen myself. That year, I booked a cabin deeper in the woods than I usually did. I found it through a small online rental site. It wasn't a popular listing. No reviews, just a few blurry photos, but the description said it was 10 miles from the nearest house, had a small wood stove, a well pump, and no road access during the colder months. That sounded perfect to me. The more cut off, the better. I drove up in the last week of October. The road turned into gravel about an hour outside the nearest town, then narrowed until it was little more than a 2-track path. I parked in a clearing where the owner said to leave the car, then hiked in the rest of the way with a full pack and some extra food. The trail wasn't marked, but the instructions were good. After about an hour and a half of walking through thinning trees and uphill slopes, I saw the roof through the branches. The cabin looked almost exactly like the photos. Rough wood siding, a tin roof streaked with rust, a small porch with 2 steps that leaned inward slightly. It sat on a slope with the woods thick on all sides. The windows were old and framed in warped wood. A chimney poked out of the roof, and the only thing around it was silence. No bird sounds, no wind, just stillness. Inside, it was cleaner than I expected. Dusty but not filthy. There was a cot with a rolled-up pad on top, a small table near the window, and a couple of shelves stocked with old cooking gear and a box of matches. The wood stove sat in the corner with a small pile of cut logs next to it. The well pump was about 20 feet out back, down a slope with a metal bucket chained nearby. I checked it before I unpacked, just to be safe, and the water came out slow but clear. I settled in quickly. First night went by without much trouble. It was colder than I thought it would be, and I didn't sleep great. Wood stoves are finicky and hard to keep hot all night, but that was nothing I hadn't dealt with before. I spent most of the next day hiking the area around the cabin, looking for signs of game or any water sources deeper in. I didn't see much. A few old deer tracks, some fresh bear scat, and what looked like a half-collapsed trapline deeper in the trees. Probably old, but I gave it space. By the 3rd day, I was starting to really settle in. I read a lot, kept the fire going, cooked simple meals. The water stayed clean, and the cold was manageable. The only strange thing I noticed was how quiet the forest was. Even in fall, you hear things. Branches creaking, squirrels moving through leaves, birds. But out there was just a constant hush. I figured maybe the wind patterns were blocked by the terrain, or maybe it was just a dead zone for wildlife. The weirdness started on the 4th night. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of the door moving. Not banging or slamming, just creaking. It had been latched from the inside before I went to bed. I sat up slowly and listened hard. The fire had burned down to embers, so the only light came from the red glow of coals and the faint silver wash of moonlight through the window. Couldn't see much. I heard the door creak again, just a slight shift, like it was being nudged. I got up quietly and picked up the axe I kept next to the cot. I didn't rush, didn't breathe heavy, just listened. After about a minute, the door stopped moving. I waited another 10, still nothing. Eventually, I eased over and pushed a chair against it, just to block it, then got back in my bag and watched the door until I fell asleep again. In the morning, I checked the outside. No prints. The ground was covered in dead leaves, and if anything had been there, they hadn't left a mark. No scratches on the wood, no signs of anything being forced. I figured it must have been the wind or maybe the frame shifting as temperatures dropped. Still, it felt off. I made a mental note to be more cautious and spent the rest of the day close to the cabin. That evening, I brought the firewood in early and res-tacked it just inside the door. I cooked dinner, read for a while, then latched the door and blocked it again before bed. I even propped the axe closer just in case. Felt silly, but I'd rather feel silly than unprepared. That night, it wasn't the door that woke me. It was a sound like dragging long, slow, across the outside wall of the cabin. It started near the front and moved along the side. I held my breath and sat up. It happened again. A long scraping noise like something hard being pulled across wood. Not clawing, not scratching, more like metal on timber. I stayed completely still and waited. It stopped after maybe 30 seconds. I didn't hear any footsteps. I didn't hear the forest at all, actually. No leaves moving, no wind. Just a thick, dead silence. In the morning, I went outside and walked the perimeter. I didn't find anything until I checked the back wall. About 3 feet up, running along the siding, was a long scrape, deep enough to mark through the outer layer of wood, maybe 4 or 5 feet long. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I ran my finger over it. The edges were fresh. I looked for prints again. Found none. Just more silence. That day, I seriously considered leaving. I even packed most of my food and rolled up my bag. But something in me refused to walk out. Maybe it was pride. Maybe stubbornness. I told myself it was probably a falling branch or an animal with something stuck to it. A bear dragging chain, maybe. But bears don't walk in a straight line next to walls. Still, I stayed. The 6th day, I went farther out, looking for any signs of people. I thought maybe there were squatters or hunters messing around. I found nothing. No wrappers, no footprints, no spent shells or tree markings. Just old paths and quiet trees. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there in my bag with the axe beside me and the fire kept hot. I kept the lantern lit low and watched the walls. Around 1:45 a.m., I heard it again. The dragging sound. This time it came from the roof. It started near the chimney and moved slowly down toward the front. Something heavy, scraping lightly as it moved. No thuds, no footfalls, just that slow scrape. Then a soft thump, like something dropping to the ground outside the door. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I sat upright with the axe across my legs and stared at the door. Nothing else happened. The sound didn't return. I didn't fall asleep. The sun came up slow, and when it did, I went outside again. I checked the roof from the slope and didn't see anything. But there was a new mark near the base of the door. A dent in the wood, like something had hit it low and hard. No footprints, not even mine from the night before. The ground just didn't hold tracks. I packed everything after that. All my food, my bag, the stove gear I'd brought. I filled both water bottles and tightened every strap. I planned to leave before noon. It was a long walk back to the car, but I could make it before dark if I pushed hard. Just before I left, I noticed something near the back wall of the cabin. At first I thought it was a piece of trash, maybe some old paper that had blown in. But when I picked it up, it wasn't paper. It was an old rag, stiff with dried stains. Dark, rusty red-brown, like it had been soaked and dried many times over. Folded inside it was a small tin round, dented, about the size of a snuff can. I opened it. Inside were teeth, human teeth, at least 10 of them. Some still had fragments of root. Some had fillings. They were clean, dry, and real. I threw the tin deep into the trees and walked away. I didn't run, but I moved fast. I didn't stop for water. I didn't look back. Every crack of a branch made my spine go tight. Every shadow in the trees felt like something crouched and watching. When I finally reached my car, the driver's side door was open. Not wide, just unlatched, slightly ajar. I never leave it like that. I hadn't been there in 6 days. The dust on the windshield had been wiped off in a single long streak, like a hand or a sleeve had dragged across it. I got in and started the engine without checking anything else. I drove fast, didn't stop in town, didn't talk to anyone. I didn't report it. I didn't know what to report. A scratched wall? A tin of teeth? No one would take that seriously. And what if someone had been out there? What if they were still out there, waiting for whoever came next? I don't go on cabin trips anymore. I still hike sometimes, but only on marked trails. Only where other people go. I keep a tracker on me, and I never camp in the same place twice. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I picture that streak on my windshield. The hand that wiped it. Not to clean it. Not to see inside. Just to let me know they'd been there. Just to show me I'd been watched the whole time. I'd been backpacking for 9 days when I found the cabin. My plan was to go 13 days through a stretch of backcountry forest in the northern part of the state, a place most people don't bother with. The terrain isn't postcard beautiful, just a long sprawl of ridgelines, deep tree cover, and narrow valleys that stay muddy year-round. But that's what I liked about it. No crowds, no phones, no noise. That 9th day had been harder than expected. The elevation gain wore me out, and the trail, if it could still be called that, kept disappearing in overgrowth. I turned my ankle earlier on some loose rock. Nothing serious, but enough to slow me down. By late afternoon, I was tired, sore, and annoyed. I just wanted somewhere flat to stop, somewhere dry to set up camp. That's when I saw the roof. It was about 100 feet off the trail, mostly hidden by a patch of spruce. A tin roof, rusted and sloped. I pushed through the trees and found the rest of it. An old hunting cabin. The boards were warped and the porch sagged, but it looked solid. Small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a chimney on one side and a door hanging just slightly ajar. The windows were fogged over and grime covered, and there was moss growing on the lower edges of the walls. Nobody had stayed here in years, maybe longer. Felt like a good find. My ankle hurt, my shoulders were tight from the weight of my pack, and the idea of a roof, even a decaying one, was better than setting up my tarp in mud. I knocked some of the weeds away from the front and stepped up onto the porch. Creaked but held my weight. The door gave a little resistance, then opened with a low scrape across the floor. Inside, it was musty and still. Light filtered through a crack in one wall and through the dirt-caked windows. The place was dusty but not trashed. A wood stove sat in the corner, and a small cot leaned against the far wall. A rough wooden table stood beneath one of the windows, with a single chair tucked in next to it. A few rusted pans hung on nails. I saw no signs of recent life, no food wrappers, no boot prints, no trash. Just old dust, cobwebs, and the smell of mold. And then I saw the bones. They were in the far corner, piled up beneath the cot and scattered like someone had dropped them there carelessly. Some long, some short. They looked old, yellowed, dry, picked clean. No flesh, just bone. I stared for a long time before walking over. I didn't want to touch them. Some looked animal, thin, curved, rib-like, but others were harder to place. A few had jagged ends like they'd been broken, maybe cut. There were no skulls, just bones. No signs of fur or clothing, just clean, quiet decay. Above them, hanging from the beams in the ceiling, were traps. At least 6 or 7 steel-jawed traps hung by chains. The rust was thick on some of them, but others looked newer, like they'd been cleaned. Not recently, but not decades ago either. They hung there with the weight of old tools, heavy and solid. Below them, on the table, sat a stack of papers. I stepped closer. They weren't proper notebooks, just scraps of paper. Pages torn from books, napkins, envelopes. Most were stained. Some looked like they'd been burned on one edge. The writing on them wasn't done in ink. It was dark, rusty brown. I leaned in and smelled the faint coppery scent. Blood. The handwriting was shaky, messy, sometimes just a scrawl across the page. A few notes looked older, their lettering faded and stiff, but others were sharp and fresh-looking. One stood out. It was on the back of a map, a corner torn and curled. The words were written dead center in thick smears. October 14th, traps are baited. They wait at dusk. Don't sleep near the walls. October 14th. That was today. I checked my watch. 5:48 p.m. Something clenched in my stomach. I don't know why. The cabin was abandoned, clearly. The bones were old. The traps hadn't been touched in months, maybe years. But that note, fresh, or at least fresher than the others, felt too close. Too recent. I looked around again. The dust on the table hadn't been disturbed. My boot prints were the only ones on the floor. Nothing showed recent movement. I stood still and just listened. The forest outside was quiet. No birds, no wind, no rustle of branches, just stillness. I moved slowly, trying not to let my gear clank or my boots scuff. I took out my headlamp, turned it on, and checked the corners of the room. Nothing. No markings, no hidden doors, no signs that anyone else had been there. Still, I didn't feel good about it. Something about the note felt wrong, too direct. I thought about packing up and moving on, but my ankle throbbed bad. I didn't trust myself to hike in the dark, and setting up camp in bear country at night is worse than staying put. I decided to stay just one night. I moved the cot to the center of the room, away from the walls like the note said. I rolled out my sleeping pad and bag, made a quick dinner of cold rice and tuna, and tried not to think too much. I checked the traps on the wall again. One of them had dried hair stuck in its teeth, a small tuft of something gray and wiry. I left it alone. By 8:30 it was dark. I turned off my headlamp and let my eyes adjust. The moonlight through the cracks and windows gave just enough light to see the shapes inside. The cot, the table, the traps. I lay back in my bag and listened to the silence. Then, around 9:15, I heard the first trap snap. It was a sharp, metallic clack from outside the cabin, maybe 20 feet off. I froze. My heart kicked hard. I sat up slowly and waited. A few seconds later, another snap, closer this time. Then a third, from behind the cabin. The air felt colder. I didn't move. I sat there in my bag, sweating despite the cold. I thought about animals, maybe a fox, maybe raccoons, but it didn't sound like that. The snaps were spaced out, one by one, and too heavy, like someone was walking the perimeter, setting them off on purpose. A minute passed, then two. Then I heard something scrape against the porch. Not a footstep, a drag, like something metal across wood. Then quiet again. I held my breath. My knife was in my hand now, pulled from my pack in the dark without even thinking. I stayed completely still, back against the cot, eyes on the door. The night stretched long. No more traps snapped, but I kept hearing soft sounds. Crunching in the leaves, slight shuffles, a knock against the far wall. I didn't sleep at all. I just sat there, breathing slow, eyes wide, trying not to move. Around 4 a.m., the sounds stopped. Everything went dead silent again. I waited until the first gray light started to seep in through the window before I dared to move. I packed fast. I didn't eat. I didn't check the traps outside. I didn't look for tracks. I just got out. Back on the trail, I walked fast and didn't look back. My ankle hurt, but I didn't care. I made it 10 miles before stopping to drink water. I didn't see another soul that day, or the next. When I finally reached the trailhead 2 days later, I sat on the curb next to my car for a long time before I unlocked it. I didn't feel relief. I felt like something was still watching. I didn't tell anyone about the cabin. Not at first, but the image of that note, fresh blood, today's date, don't sleep near the walls, kept replaying in my head. So a week later, after cleaning up and resting, I went online and pulled up old forestry maps. I looked for abandoned hunting leases in that area. There were a few. Some dated back to the 60s and 70s. One stood out, leased to a man named Wallace Truman, known to use traps for predator control. Reports from locals claimed he disappeared sometime in the early 2000s. Last seen heading out toward his old cabin with a rifle and a backpack. No body ever found. There was a note in one article from a forest ranger. Said the traps they found up there had been reset multiple times, long after the lease expired. The report said someone was maintaining them, but they couldn't confirm who. I don't know who's still out there. Maybe nobody. Maybe someone's just been squatting in those woods, living off the land, scaring off strangers. But someone baited those traps. Someone left that note, and they knew I was coming. I wasn't supposed to stay in the cabin for more than 2 nights, but things changed. Originally, it was meant to be a quiet weekend off-grid. No work calls, no emails, no noise. Just time to disconnect. I rented the cabin through a small, regional site. Not one of the major platforms. This was the kind of place listed through word of mouth and small classifieds. The pictures were grainy, and there weren't many reviews, but it was cheap, and I liked that it was remote. Just woods, a dirt road, and the cabin. That was all I needed. The cabin sat about an hour from the nearest town, 10 miles off the main highway, down a winding road that narrowed until it turned to gravel. I stopped at a gas station before heading in to grab some last-minute things. Extra water, jerky, trail mix, duct tape, and 2 spare batteries for my flashlight. I also bought a few rounds for the old revolver I keep in the glove box just to be cautious. I had no reason to expect trouble, but something about going into the deep woods alone always put a small edge on my nerves. By the time I got there, it was around 4:30 p.m. The sun had already started its slow slide down the trees, casting long shadows through the branches. The cabin itself was simple, one story with an attic crawl space I assumed was just for storage. It had wood siding, faded from years of weather. The porch creaked as I stepped onto it. There was a swing hanging from 2 rusted chains that barely moved when I brushed past it. Inside, it smelled like old cedar and dust. The air was cool, dry. The layout was simple. One big room with a kitchenette, a table, and a twin bed pushed up against the wall. There was a wood stove in the corner and a tiny bathroom with no real door, just a curtain. There wasn't any electricity, but there were oil lamps mounted to the walls. I lit one and unpacked my gear. Sleeping bag, clothes, knife, portable stove, a tin coffee pot, and a small solar charger for my phone. Not that I had any signal. There was a manual pump out back for water, and an outhouse maybe 30 feet from the rear porch. I walked around the place slowly after unpacking, getting a sense of my surroundings. The forest came right up to the back of the cabin. Thick pine, spruce, and some birch. The tree line out front opened into a wide, grassy clearing, maybe 40 yards across, with a small slope that dropped toward a dry creek bed. I felt good that first night. The quiet was deep, the kind that hums in your ears when there's no traffic, no appliances, no voices. I made a simple dinner, read a few chapters from an old paperback I brought, and went to sleep early. It was around 2 a.m. when I first woke up. No sound, nothing obvious, but I felt aware, like something had changed. I laid still in the dark, listening. The night was heavy with silence. Then I heard a thud, light, dull, like something falling gently against the side of the cabin. I sat up slowly and stayed still for maybe a full minute. Another thud. Same sound, same place. It wasn't an animal scampering or tree branches tapping. It was slower than that. Intentional, like someone leaning against the wall. I pulled on my boots without turning on the lamp and grabbed the revolver. My hands were steady. I'd had this feeling before during hunting trips, being watched without knowing where from. I stepped to the door and opened it quietly. The porch creaked again. I stepped out into the cold, moonlit clearing and listened. There was no one. I walked the perimeter of the cabin slowly, light steps, trying not to snap twigs or crunch leaves. I circled once. Nothing. I stayed out there for 15 minutes, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Eventually, I went back in and forced myself to go back to sleep, though it was light and broken. The next day, I found footprints behind the cabin, leading up toward the back porch. They were human, boots not too big, not too small. A few clear imprints, then the trail faded where the ground got firmer. My own prints were deeper and fresh, going the opposite direction. These were not mine. Someone had walked up to the cabin during the night and then left. No attempt to break in, no sign of forced entry, just those soft knocks on the wall and the footprints. I should have packed up and left then, but I didn't. Maybe it was pride, maybe just denial. I didn't want to believe someone would just walk up to a remote cabin and mess with a stranger. I spent most of the day inside with the revolver nearby, reading, keeping one ear open at all times. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the old wooden chair near the stove, lamp low, revolver in my lap. Around 1:40 a.m., I heard footsteps in the leaves. Slow, deliberate, coming from behind the cabin. Then silence. Then the knock again, same dull pressure against the wall. I didn't move. I listened, breathing shallow, every muscle tense. Whoever it was didn't try the door. They didn't knock on it. Just stood there. Then nothing. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat there until morning light began leaking in through the windows. At sunrise, I searched again. This time, I found something different. On the edge of the clearing near the dry creek bed, I saw the outline of a small camp. A flat area where the grass had been pressed down. A few old footprints. A small circle of stones, cold ashes in the center. Someone had been camping there recently. maybe still was. That's when the realization hit me. Someone was living out here, not just passing through, watching, maybe for days before I even got there. I couldn't see their tent, but that didn't mean much. With camo fabric and enough brush, you could disappear from 20 feet away. I decided I would leave the next morning. I didn't want to risk driving in the dark, not with the road conditions and the thought of someone possibly following. I spent that whole last day with every window covered, door locked, revolver close. I didn't eat. I didn't even use the outhouse after dark. Just waited. That last night, I stayed awake in the same chair. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Then 2 knocks on the wall closer together. Then silence. I didn't move. I sat there, holding my breath. I knew they were standing just feet away on the other side of the wall. Then came something new. A sound near the attic hatch in the ceiling. A soft creak. My eyes snapped upward. The attic was just a crawl space with a panel you could push open. I hadn't even thought about it. There was no ladder or access point, but now I saw it. A small, almost imperceptible shift in the panel cover. Like pressure, just a hair of movement. I aimed the revolver straight up and didn't move for 10 minutes. Eventually, the movement stopped. The first light, I packed everything as fast as I could. Threw my bag in the truck, checked the tires, and drove out. I didn't stop. Not for coffee, not for gas. I just kept going until I hit a main road with traffic. A week later, I called the number from the cabin listing and left a message. I told the owner about the footprints, the knocks, the movement. They never called me back. 3 months later, I saw a news article online. It was buried under regional headlines. Authorities had arrested a man in connection with a string of break-ins in the northern part of the state. He'd been living off-grid for years, in and out of old cabins, sometimes squatting in attics and basements while people stayed in them. No one knew how many places he'd been. They found him in the woods, not far from where I'd stayed. When they raided his camp, they found clothes, tools, some stolen food, and a pair of binoculars. Also, a notebook. In it were short entries, dates, times, notes about cabins, who was staying, what they were doing when they went to sleep. I never learned for sure if my name or that cabin was in the notebook. But I don't need to. I know someone was there. I know they watched me. I know they walked to that wall and listened. And I know I left just in time. I rented the cabin for one reason: peace and quiet. I was behind on a book deadline, and I needed to get out of the city, away from the constant noise and distractions. It was early October, and I figured a week in the mountains would help me focus. I found the place online, a small, remote cabin about 2 hours from the nearest town, perched on the edge of a thick forest, not far from the base of a jagged mountain range. The pictures showed a simple wood cabin with a tin roof, a stone chimney, and a porch facing the woods. No neighbors, no traffic, no signal. It was perfect. The man who owned it was in his 60s. He met me at the edge of the property where the gravel road ended and handed me the keys. He wore a red flannel jacket, old jeans, and heavy boots. His face looked like it had seen 1,000 winters. He said little, just showed me the essentials: how to start the generator, how to use the propane heater, where the well pump was. Before he left, he looked at me seriously and said, "Don't open the basement door." That was it. He didn't explain, just turned and walked down the gravel path to his truck and drove away. I thought about asking him what he meant, but something about the way he said it made me let it go. I figured maybe there were structural issues down there, or maybe he just stored personal stuff. I wasn't there to poke around anyway. I had work to do. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, set up my laptop, and walked around the cabin. It had a single bedroom, a kitchen with a gas stove, a living room with an old wood stove, and a narrow hallway that ended with a heavy wooden door with an iron handle. That was the basement door. There was a padlock on it. I noticed that right away. Big and old, with rust around the latch. It didn't rattle like it was loose, but it looked like it had been locked for a long time. I ran my hand over it out of habit. The door was solid. Too solid. The kind of door you'd use to keep something out or in. I slept well that first night. The quiet was a relief. No sirens, no honking, no neighbors stomping around upstairs. Just wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The kind of silence that makes you realize how loud the rest of your life really is. On the second night, I started hearing the noises. It began with a soft scraping. At first, I thought it was tree branches against the siding, but the sound was coming from the floor, not the walls. It was faint, like something brushing against the underside of the cabin. I froze, just listening. Then came a low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. Slow and steady, then a pause. Then again. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded too regular, too controlled. I got up and walked toward the hallway. The noise was louder there, just behind the basement door. I stood in front of it, listening. I could hear a shuffling sound, then another slow scrape, like something being dragged across concrete. I waited for a minute, maybe two, but then it stopped. Total silence again. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe an animal had gotten underneath the cabin. Maybe the wood was expanding from the cold. I'd barely slept and was likely on edge. I made coffee, sat at the desk by the window, and forced myself to work. But the sounds kept happening. Every night around the same time, just after midnight, they started again. The scraping, the breathing, sometimes even what sounded like a faint knock, 3 soft taps, spaced far apart. Always from the basement, always followed by silence. By the 5th night, I was unraveling. I hadn't written anything useful in 2 days. My nerves were frayed. I spent most of my time pacing, staring at that door, listening. I started putting things against it. First just a chair, then a heavy box of books, then the kitchen table. The padlock was still in place, but I needed to feel like I was doing something. I'd sit in the living room, lights off, waiting for the sounds. And they came, louder now, almost impatient. The breathing was harsher, more deliberate. I could hear footsteps sometimes, slow and dragging. I tried calling the owner, but I had no service. I couldn't send a text or even load a basic page. The landline in the kitchen didn't have a dial tone. I hadn't noticed that before. I thought maybe I had knocked something loose while rearranging things in my panic. I told myself I was just tired, imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was down there. Not something supernatural, I didn't believe in ghosts, but something real and alive. That 6th night, the sound stopped. I waited for hours. Midnight came and went. Nothing. No scraping. No breathing. Not a single noise. The silence was worse than the sounds. Felt loaded, like the calm before something bad. And then, the next morning, I found the padlock on the floor. I stood in the hallway staring at it. The door was still shut, but the lock was no longer latched. I picked it up. It wasn't broken. It hadn't been cut or forced. The latch was open, like someone had unlocked it and set it down gently. My blood ran cold. I didn't open the door. Not yet. Instead, I packed up my things. I was done. I had no interest in whatever this was. Maybe it was a sick joke, or maybe the owner had left someone down there. I didn't want to know. I threw everything into my car and tried to drive out. The road was blocked. A tree had come down across the narrow gravel path. Big, old, and freshly fallen. I could smell the sap in the air. I tried backing out and turning around, but the angles were too tight and the surrounding brush was too dense. Couldn't go forward. Couldn't go back. I got out and tried dragging the branches, but they were too thick. I didn't have an axe or a saw. I was stuck. That night, the sounds came back, louder than ever. I sat in the hallway for hours, staring at the door. Something banged against it, hard. Then again. I could hear something breathing fast, almost panting. I backed away slowly, heart pounding in my chest. I sat in the bedroom, lights off, door locked, holding the only thing I had, a rusted fireplace poker. Around 3 a.m., it stopped. When morning came, I stood in front of the basement door again. The padlock was gone. Not just off, gone. I looked everywhere. Nothing. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was angry. Maybe I just needed to know. I pulled the kitchen table away, then the boxes, then the chair. My hands were shaking. I reached out and gripped the iron handle. It was cold. I pulled the door open. The smell hit me first. Rot, sweat, something damp and old. The air was heavy, like the air in an old meat locker that hasn't worked in years. I stepped down slowly. The stairs were wooden and steep, creaking under my weight. The light was dim. There was a bare bulb hanging at the bottom with a string pull. I yanked it and the bulb flickered on. What I saw wasn't what I expected. There was no monster, no strange creature, no supernatural horror, just a man. He was lying in the corner, curled up, facing the wall. His hair was long and matted. His skin was pale and raw in patches, like it had been rubbed off. He was filthy, covered in grime, scratches, bruises. His hands were shaking. I thought he was dead at first, but then he moved, twitched, slowly turned his head. His eyes locked on mine, wide, bloodshot, hollow. He didn't say anything, just stared. I backed up a step. He didn't follow, just kept staring. There were chains on the floor, old iron shackles bolted into the concrete. They weren't attached to him now, but they had been. You could see the wear marks on his wrists and ankles. There was a bucket in the corner, stained with waste. Torn blanket, a few empty cans. I didn't go any closer. I went back upstairs, shut the door, and sat on the floor. I don't know how long he'd been down there. Months, maybe years. The sounds I'd heard, scraping, breathing, knocking, those were real. He had been trying to get out, or maybe just trying to be heard. I kept thinking about the padlock, how it had been opened. Either he found a way to pick it or someone came in and let him out. Maybe the owner, maybe someone else. But here's what I think now. He wasn't just someone the owner was hiding. He was someone the owner was keeping. Maybe a brother, maybe a son, maybe worse, someone dangerous. Not in a supernatural way, in a real human way, like someone who had done terrible things, and the family had made their own prison rather than call the police. Someone they couldn't explain, couldn't control. I left the next morning. I walked for miles until I found a ranger station. They called the sheriff. I told them everything. They sent people up. The basement was empty when they got there. No man, no blanket, no chains, nothing. They searched the woods for days. Nothing turned up. The owner never answered his phone. The cabin was abandoned. The last record of him was months before I'd arrived. He'd stopped paying taxes. We'd been talking about a trip like this for years. Early spring, right after the thaw, but before the bugs came out. A long weekend away from everything: work, noise, phones, all of it. We were five: me, Eric, Nate, Jordan, and Drew. We all grew up together, split apart by jobs and life, but somehow kept in touch just enough to pull this off once in a while. A long drive into the woods, a few days of quiet, some beers, hiking, maybe a little fishing. That was the idea. The cabin wasn't fancy, and that's what we wanted. Someplace old, built by hand, probably creaked in the wind. It sat on the north side of a lake that barely had a name, way up in the Adirondacks. You couldn't find it unless someone showed you the way. Nate knew a guy who gave us the code to the gate and the combination to the lockbox on the front door. He said the place had been sealed up since October. First freeze hit early that year. No one had been up since. We left early Friday morning in 2 cars. The weather was still cold but warming up. Snow was melted off the roads, though you could see it in the trees and hills. Patches of white here and there. By the time we got to the lake road, the signal was gone. Phones just read no service. We followed the map Nate printed out, slow over muddy gravel, tires slipping sometimes. The sun was still up but getting low when we found the gate. The padlock looked rusted but opened easy. We drove through tall trees up a slope, and then the cabin came into view. It was tucked into a clearing, just a short walk to the water, with siding, a small porch, 2 floors. Smokestack crooked on the roof. It looked peaceful, empty, a little forgotten. We got out and stretched, grabbed our gear from the trunks. I remember how quiet it was. No wind, no birds even, just us, crunching gravel and slamming car doors. Nate went up first with the code for the box. Clicked open and he slid the key out. Then the front door creaked open, and I swear I felt it. Warm air on my face, which didn't make sense. It was early spring in the mountains. The sun was going down and we'd been wearing jackets the whole ride. But that air? It was like someone had just been cooking or sitting by a fire. Warm, still, a little musty but not cold. Inside was the first sign something wasn't right. We walked in slow, looking around. There was a smell. Not bad, not rot, but lived in. The living room had a couch, a chair, a small wood stove in the corner. And the stove, there was a glow through the little glass door. Not raging flames, but orange embers. Still hot. I walked over and knelt. The metal radiated warmth. I opened the door. Black wood, glowing inside. That thing had been burning today, not months ago. I stood up and turned. That's when I noticed the mugs. 3 of them, sitting on the counter near the kitchen. Ceramic, each with a ring of liquid still inside. And steam barely there, curling upward. Not boiling hot, but warm, just recently poured. Clothes were laid out on the back of the couch. A hoodie, jeans, not folded, just laid flat like someone had planned to put them on. A pair of boots were by the door, muddy, fresh, but no one was there. We checked the whole place. Upstairs, downstairs. Small basement that smelled of oil and old wood. There was an axe by the back door, a pile of chopped wood, a cooler in the kitchen with some melted ice in the bottom. But no people, not even a car. We looked around the trees. Nothing. No tire tracks. No footprints but ours. That whole night, it stayed weird. We ate sandwiches, drank a few beers, but it was quiet. Too quiet. No one laughed much. No fire was lit because that stove was still warm. We sat with our jackets off and the windows open, like we were waiting for someone to come back and say, "Hey, what are you doing in my house?" We figured maybe someone had squatted here. Maybe a hunter or a caretaker. Maybe they left in a hurry. But who leaves hot coffee and a fire? The sun went down around 7. Light disappeared fast. We got the lanterns out and set up our sleeping bags upstairs, though nobody wanted to sleep alone. I think we all felt it. Something was off. I laid there, not really sleeping, listening to the others shift around, clear their throats, whisper something under their breath. The wind came back around midnight. Not strong, just enough to make the trees creak. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were outside, crunching slow over old leaves and thawed mud. Heavy steps, not boots, barefoot or socks maybe. Muffled, just pressure on the earth. Then they stopped. I didn't move. My sleeping bag was half zipped, arms inside, heart pounding. I turned my head slow to look at the window. Nothing there, just black. Then the front door creaked. Not like it opened fully, just the hinge. A shift in weight. It groaned, then clicked. I couldn't tell if it was wind or pressure, but something moved. I waited. Minutes passed. Then something creaked on the stairs. Just one step. We hadn't locked the door. I lay still, listening so hard my ears hurt. No one else moved. I thought maybe I was the only one awake. Or maybe the others were doing the same, frozen, waiting. Another step. Then nothing. I don't know how long I lay there. Eventually, I must have drifted off. My brain gave up. The sun came up slow, orange through the trees. Everyone was quiet. Drew got up first. Then Nate. No one said anything, but we all looked at the stairs. Nothing was there. Door was shut, still unlocked. We checked outside. Mud tracks were there near the porch. Barefoot. One set. No prints leading away. Just up to the door. No animals around. No sign of anyone else. We locked the door after that. Chained it too. Took turns sitting by the window all morning. Like idiots. By noon, we convinced ourselves it was just a bad night. Wind. Imagination. We ate breakfast. Chopped some wood. Tried to shake it off. But we didn't go far. No hikes. No lake. No exploring. That night, it got worse. We lit the fire this time. Stoked it until the room was hot. Locked the windows. Drew even stacked a chair against the front door. It didn't help. Around 1 a.m., I heard a knock. Just one. Not loud. Like a tap. Then another. Not on the front door. On the window upstairs. We were all upstairs. Lights off, just lying there. Then we heard it again. Another knock. Then the sound of footsteps on the roof. That did it. We jumped up, scrambled for flashlights. Nate had a hatchet. I grabbed my boots and pulled them on without socks. We went down fast, turned on every lantern, every flashlight. The fire was still going, but the room felt cold. Not air cold, something else. Like standing in a freezer even though the flame was alive. We checked the front and back doors. Still locked. No sign of anyone. But something had been up there. Dust was shifted near the upstairs window. Leaves were scattered over the roof's edge. We didn't go back to sleep. Sat in the living room until daylight. No one said anything. No one looked out the windows. When morning came, we packed. Didn't even clean. Just grabbed our stuff and shoved it into bags. Nate said we'd leave a note. I told him not to bother. We didn't owe anybody anything. I loaded my stuff into the car and saw something that nearly made me vomit. Behind the cabin, near the tree line, there was a small fire ring. Rocks in a circle, ashes in the middle. And right there, 3 mugs. Ceramic, still warm, steam rising, and clothes, laid out neat. A hoodie, jeans, socks rolled and placed, boots beside them, not ours. We didn't run. We didn't scream. We just got into the cars and drove. Fast, down the gravel, out the gate, back onto pavement. We didn't stop until we hit a town with a diner and people and noise. That was over a year ago. We never went back. I still think about it. Not every day, but some days. I checked online. Nothing about missing people in that area. No weird news. Nothing strange. But something happened out there. I think someone was living in that cabin. Maybe not full-time, but enough. Maybe it was a trap. Maybe we were supposed to find it the way we did. I don't know. We didn't see a face. We didn't hear a voice. But someone was there. And they never left. And whoever they were, they didn't want to be seen. They just wanted us to know they were close. Watching. Waiting.